This was the beginning of what became known as the Red River War that lasted for several months. And here on the map, you can see all the major locations. You can see there where the Kiowa Comanche Reservation was, with Fort Sill there in the middle of it. The Cheyenne Arapaho Reservation to their north, that's the Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho. You can see the location of Adobe Walls. It's right there in the middle of that small red X that all the arrows are pointing toward. You can even see where Dodge City was up there in southwestern Kansas. Now, after the attack on Adobe Walls, there were several other skirmishes. Lone Wolf led a group of Kiowas that attacked a group of Texas Rangers, a place called Lost Valley. And General Sheridan, remember the chain of command, General Sherman is in overall command of the Army. General Sheridan is in command of the West. Sheridan ordered 5 different columns of the Army to head into the area where these various tribes were being most active, around the Texas Panhandle there. One column from each of 5 different forts. The idea being, with 5 different columns sweeping through, there'd be no place that the Native Americans could hide or evade them. Now, to the left there, the lower left-hand quadrant of the map, Staked Plain, also known as the Llano Estacado. That is the area where Quanah Parker and his Quahati Comanches had, well, that was their territory, and they had not left it, and they had not gone onto a reservation to begin with. Now, of these 5 columns, the one that's coming from farthest to the south, out of Fort Concho in Texas, was the 4th Cavalry, and I may have misspoken in one of the earlier presentations and said 5th, I don't remember, but it was the 4th Cavalry, commanded by Colonel Ronald McKenzie, and that's him on the right. Haven't talked too much about him yet, but he's a fascinating character. He was known to the Indians by the name Bad Hand because he had, actually during the Civil War, he had been injured several times. At one point, a cannonball had hit his horse in the chest and passed right between his legs. On another occasion, a piece of shrapnel had come through and hit his hand, tearing off 3 of his fingers, hence the name Bad Hand. And he was known as an extremely capable commander, which I think is an interesting contrast to Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, who actually, became very famous, but didn't really accomplish that much in comparison, particularly to someone like Mackenzie. Anyhow, the war is on. Here is a map of the major battle sites of the Red River War, and the fighting mostly took place between that attack on Adobe Walls and November of that year. There were about 20 skirmishes altogether. These are the ones that this map maker deemed major. Some of them were bigger than others, but you may want to refer back to this map as we talk about some of the things coming up. On September 12th, 1874, about 125 warriors that included some that were led by Lone Wolf and Satanta had just come from attacking an Army supply wagon train and headed south after that, and they encountered 6 soldiers from the I think it was the 6th Cavalry under Colonel Nelson Miles. Well, actually, it was 4 cavalry troopers and 2 scouts. One of the scouts was Billy Dixon, the same guy who 2 months before had made that incredible long shot at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. So after that, he had signed up as a scout for the Army. The initial attack on this small group, and by the way, they were they were carrying dispatches from one fort to another. That's why they were such a small group. The initial attack led to 5 out of the 6 being wounded. The only one unwounded was Dixon. He saw nearby a buffalo wallow, which is sort of a depression in the ground where buffalo roll around, and basically they've been rolling around scratching themselves and stuff. So he directed everybody to get to that. And so they did, even though they were all injured to some degree, except for the other scout who had been shot in the leg, which had broken his leg, and he couldn't walk. So Dixon ran back out and picked him up and carried him back to the buffalo wallow. One of the other soldiers, a Private Smith, was shot through the lungs, and he eventually died. So the rest of them were there. They used their knives to dig in the dirt and make the wallow just a little bit deeper to give them some cover. And the warriors charged repeatedly at them, and a lot of gunfire was exchanged. Eventually, there was a big thunderstorm, and the warriors then retreated and left the soldiers there surviving. At the end of all that, when they got back and reported, what had happened and so forth, all 6 were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Smith, of course, posthumously. And this didn't involve a lot of people, and there was only one person out of the 6 was killed. As usual, we don't know how many casualties there were on the other side, but it was extremely dramatic. Now, a lot of the other skirmishes and fights had a lot more bloodshed than this one did, but you got to admit, it's an interesting story, and this is the one that has survived in folklore and so forth. The most important and most decisive battle of the Red River War was the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon, which took place on September 28th, 1874. Even though there were several smaller skirmishes after that, this is the one that was really, like I said, decisive. Now, there was a large force of Native Americans, Southern Plains Indians, that several bands worth, that had joined together in sort of a major hideout at the floor of Palo Duro Canyon, which is in the Staked Plains, the Llano Estacado, which is right there on the map on the left, that really, really dry, flat area right along the border of New Mexico and the Texas Panhandle. It is very difficult terrain. It's very dry. It was referred to sometimes, I think, by Mexicans and by the Spanish as El Jornado del Muerte, Dead Man's Walk, which, if you're familiar with Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove cycle, you'll recognize that, because it was a horrible place to be on foot. However, right there in the middle of it, there was this huge, huge canyon with incredibly steep walls. And the floor of the canyon, as you can see, a little bit lush and green compared to some of the other areas. And it was very well hidden, because it is so flat out there that you don't realize you've come up on a canyon until you get right up on it, right? Because everything is flat. If you're looking from a great distance, everything looks the same. Then, if you just happen to go the right route, you come upon this canyon, and there on the floor, there's water, and various other things that you would need. So these bands were there. You had Southern Cheyenne, led by Iron Shirt, and there was also a small number of Southern Arapaho with them. You had Kiowas, led by Lone Wolf. You had Comanches, I believe it was the Quahati Band. I don't think Quanah Parker was present. I think that it was poor Buffalo who was in charge. And they were using this not only as a base of operations and a hideout, but they were also storing up supplies for the winter. So they were out there killing extra buffalo, bringing the meat down to the floor of the canyon. And they had all their horses down there, all their extra horses. Ronald Mackenzie had been looking for them fruitlessly, but his Indian scouts, he had Tonkawa scouts and also some Black Seminole scouts, found a trail that they picked up in an area where some Black Seminole scouts had been attacked by Comanches. And following that trail, they found their way to this hidden canyon and made their way very, very tortuously, difficultly, down the sides of this canyon, going in a zigzag pattern because their horses couldn't go straight down without falling. And they did that through the night, and then in the morning burst forth and attacked first the band led by Lone Wolf, scattering people before them. Now, these were not just warriors. These were the whole band, the whole family with the little kids and the old people and all that. So the soldiers came charging in and caught the Southern Plains Indians by surprise, and everyone scattered before the soldiers. They retreated with their families as quickly as they could. However, in their haste, by necessity, they were not able to round up their horses, except maybe the ones they were able to ride themselves, and I don't think everyone was even able to do that. And they had to leave behind all that meat that they had been storing up that was going to last them through the winter. So even though there was not a lot of bloodshed in this fight, there were 3 Indians killed and 1 soldier killed, and that was the extent of it. It was still a huge loss for the Indians and a huge victory for Mackenzie, because he destroyed 460 lodges, burned all their stored up meat, and captured 1,400 horses, most of which they shot, so as to keep them from falling back into the hands of the Indians. Now, the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne escaped, but with only a handful of horses. This is not the type of country you want to be in, even if you know it well, on foot, particularly if you have no supplies, and it's going to be difficult to be able to get any. As a result of this, most of those bands came in and surrendered and returned to the reservation by November of 1874. Lone Wolf's band held out a little longer. I think it was February 75 when he finally came in. Quanah Parker's Quahati Band was, like I said, I don't think they were present here. They were still out and about, but they also were greatly hampered. Their allies were all gone. And the following summer, in I think June of 1875, even Quanah Parker came in and surrendered. This was the end of military resistance on the Southern Plains. As a result of this war, and to a large extent the result of this one big battle, big not in terms of people being killed, but of importance, this marked the end of independent tribes on the Southern Plains. Everyone, all the tribes, were now confined to reservations in the South. Soon after returning to the reservation, Satanta, White Bear, was arrested and charged with violating his probation for having participated in those raids, and he was returned to prison in Texas. He was sent to the infamous Huntsville State Penitentiary, very famous Texas prison that half a century later would briefly house Clyde Barrow of Bonnie and Clyde fame. So, Setanta was sent to Huntsville prison and sentenced to hard labor. He was put in chains, sent out on a chain gang to work on the roads, and they say that often he would stop in his work and just stand, staring at the northern direction of his homeland. Finally, after 3 years in prison at hard labor in 1878, Setanta decided to fly away. He dove headfirst out of a window of the prison and plunged to his death. His descendants, many of them, believe that he was pushed or thrown out the window because suicide was not in his nature. Others, however, say that it was a final act of defiance and rebellion, not allowing himself to be imprisoned further and not allowing his captors to further humiliate him. If you're familiar with Lonesome Dove, you'll remember Blue Duck. He's hard to forget. That character was loosely based on a historical Cherokee outlaw named Blue Duck, but his demise in the story perfectly mirrored the death of Setanta. Meanwhile, the U.S. government demanded that 27 Kiowa warriors be turned over for punishment for their role in the various fighting, and they had Kicking Bird, who was the peaceful Kiowa chief, whom the government now regarded as the principal chief because he's the one that went along with what they were asking and was more accommodating. They demanded that he choose the 27, that he name them, which he did. And one of those was Lone Wolf. The 27 men were sent to be imprisoned in a dungeon in a fort in St. Augustine, Florida, where there were frequent outbreaks of disease. Here are some of the chiefs that were among the group that were sent, and that is Lone Wolf on the far left, and next to him in order are Double Vision, White Horse, Woman's Heart, and Owl Prophet. The army officer to the left there, sitting next to Lone Wolf, is Captain Richard Pratt. Remember that name. Later on, when he's a major, Richard Pratt will be the first director of the Carlisle Indian School, and we'll be talking about him again. So, these warriors were sent to prison in Florida, where they were kept for 4 years. Lone Wolf got malaria there and was in very bad health by the time he returned to the reservation. He was returned to the reservation in 1879, and he didn't live very long thereafter. Now, there was a young warrior, he was in his 30s, early 30s probably, named Mamedete, who had been a friend of Lone Wolf's son and who had saved that son's life back in 1872 in a raid on Teamsters. Then later, when Lone Wolf's son, his only son, and his nephew were killed in battle, Manedete led the raid to get revenge for them. So when Lone Wolf returned to the reservation in horrible health, declining health, and probably not long for this world, which in fact he was not, he bestowed his name on that young warrior, since his own son and his only nephew were gone. And so Manedete became known after that as Lone Wolf. He's usually referred to as Lone Wolf the Younger. And he would be the principal leader of those Kiowas who resisted assimilation and continued to agitate for their people's rights. And we'll be talking about him again before long as well. And so the Southern Plains tribes, the lords of the plains, were no longer masters of their own destiny and their own territory and their own way of living, no longer living on the buffalo. Rather, as some of the native people put it, now being forced to walk the corn road to become farmers, which is something that the U.S. government frequently did, particularly, well, they didn't care what sort of tribe it was, really. There were tribes that were already agricultural, that knew more about agriculture than the white people did, but, they still insisted they do it the white people's way. And with these folks, the Plains tribes, they were not agricultural. They had been nomadic hunters, but they will be allowed to be so no more. Quanah Parker lived for many years afterward and, in fact, became something of a celebrity. He would eventually develop a friendship with Teddy Roosevelt, who would, of course, eventually become president. He also got involved in a religious movement. Now, the Quakers, for a while, were in charge of the reservations, and if not Quakers, then clergy of some kind. So there was a concerted effort to convert the Indians to Christianity. At the same time, particularly in western Oklahoma, where they had taken all these different types of tribes and placed them all right next to each other from different regions. You had Apaches from the desert Southwest being put there. You had other tribes from as far away as the Nez Perce in the Pacific Northwest. And so you had different types of native cultures interacting for really the first time directly. They had interacted by trade before, but now they're in very close contact. And one of the things that happened is that those Apaches from the desert Southwest who were brought there, who were still in contact and in trade with the other Apaches on the other reservations in Arizona and so forth, they introduced something that was important to their culture, peyote, which the Plains Indians had been completely unfamiliar with. But they got familiar with it. And as they were experimenting with that, and at the same time, sort of taking their own approach to this Christianity thing that was being visited upon them, a whole new religious tradition developed. It was made up of bits and pieces of other cultures, including European-style Christianity, but the result was something completely new that today is known as the Native American Church. And peyote is used in their rituals, and in fact, the Supreme Court has ruled that drug laws don't apply when it comes to the practicing of religious sacraments using peyote. And Quanah Parker was one of the people that was in on the ground floor of this new religious approach. And one of my favorite quotes from anybody, really, is a quote from Quanah Parker when someone was asking him about the use of peyote and whether that was appropriate in a Christian setting. And he said, "When white people go to church, they talk about Jesus, but when we go to church, we talk to Jesus." So that's a funny story, but it is also very indicative of the staying power of Native peoples, their ability to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining still their native identities. So this would begin a new phase in the history of the Southern Plains tribes, and their companions to the north, their allies to the north, would very soon be joining them.
Now we're going to turn our attention to the Pacific coast. And as I think that we discussed in an earlier lecture, there were a lot of nations and cultures along the coast in California and in the Pacific Northwest. We're going to be looking specifically, though, at the Modoc tribe and their neighbors, the Klamath. That's them right there. Let's zoom in. There, as you can see, the Klamath were in Oregon, and the Modoc territory sort of straddled northeastern California and across the border into south central Oregon. Both these tribes have very similar cultures and in fact speak virtually the same language, but still two distinct people. I mean, I would point out that in the American Revolution, both sides spoke the same language virtually. This is a painting of the Modoc chief Yellowhammer that I believe was painted around 1901 from life. It was posed for by Yellowhammer wearing traditional Modoc clothing, so you can get an idea what that looks like. In 1864, the Modocs signed a treaty with the U.S. government in which they gave up their lands and agreed to be moved to a reservation north of their own territory, a reservation that they would share with the Klamath peoples. You can see the outline of the reservation there in dotted lines. In return, they were supposed to receive an amount of cash and commodities annually until they got established, and a staff was supposed to be provided for this reservation. However, once they got there, turns out they didn't get along that well with the Klamath. And the Klamath actually, according to the Modoc, outnumbering them, picked on them quite a bit, took away their stuff. There were about 2,000 Modoc, by the way. And so they became very discontent. So the Modoc put in a request to be moved again, to have their own reservation back in the northern part of their own territory between the Lost River and Tule Lake. You can see right there the area that they were talking about. However, that request was denied by the U.S. government. And that's where this guy came in, Kinpuash, who was the leader of one of the Modoc bands. His band had about 150 people in it, of whom about 50 were warriors, the others were women and children. The settlers called him Captain Jack, because why not, I guess. I don't know. Anyhow, Kinpuash, we're going to call him, refer to him as Captain Jack, because that's how he is in the history books henceforth. He decided to lead his band, and they decided to follow him out of the Klamath Reservation and to head back homeward. And here is another important member of his band, Choax, who was a medicine man and the spiritual leader of the band, and was called by the settlers Curly-Headed Doctor, because, again, I guess, why not? Another member of Captain Jack's band that we'll be talking about is this guy, Hooka, a young warrior who happened to be the son-in-law of Curly-Headed Doctor. The settlers called him Jim, or Hooka Jim, and eventually Hooker Jim. And a final member of the Modoc tribe that we're going to be talking about, who's going to play into our story, is this woman who was not a member of Captain Jack's band, a Modoc woman named Wanema, who was married to a white guy, a trader named Frank Riddle. Frank referred to his wife Wanema as Toby, so she was known as Toby Riddle to the settlers and to her own people as Wanema. Here in the picture, the photograph on the right, she's the woman who's standing up in the back row. And the man to the right of her with the lighter colored hat, that's her husband, Frank. Wanema, or Toby, and Frank each spoke the other's language. So the two of them were often turned to by government agents, such as federal Indian agents like the guy in the black hat there on the left, and the U.S. Army when they needed interpreters or translators. So Wanema or Toby Riddle. We have one final member of our cast of characters to introduce, one who is not Modoc. This was General Edward R.S. Canby of the U.S. Army. Originally from Kentucky, we briefly mentioned him once before, and he had been involved in several of the things that we've talked about these past few lectures. During the Civil War, he had been assigned to New Mexico. That's where he was when the war broke out. In fact, his second in command of the Department of New Mexico, a guy named Sibley, actually became a Confederate general and fought against him. Canby was the officer who led the Union troops that met up with James Carleton and drove the Confederates finally out of New Mexico. And then, as we talked about a lecture or two ago, Carleton then took over as the director of the Department of New Mexico, replacing Canby in that position. And Canby and the other Union troops were recalled back to the east. After that, Canby served in New York City right after the New York draft riots in July of 1863. And he essentially put the draft board back together in New York. Then he wound up at the end of the war serving as the military governor of Virginia for a while. Then in 1872, he was transferred to become the director of the Department of the Pacific Northwest for the U.S. Army. So he was the top-ranking general in the Pacific Northwest, and he arrived there in 1872, right around the time Captain Jack and his band left the Klamath Reservation. So it was going to be General Canby who was going to have to handle this situation. Rather than go to the area south of the Lost River where the main body of Modocs had wanted to have their reservation moved to, Captain Jack and his group went back to their own band's home territory, which was the area around Clear Lake. Now, in the years since the Modocs had been removed up into Oregon to the Klamath Reservation, a lot of settlers had moved into the area and established farms around Clear Lake. So when this Modoc band showed back up, it's, almost inevitable that there's going to be friction between them and the settlers. A group of settlers actually attacked the Modoc camp and killed several women and children, whereupon a group of warriors led by Hooker Jim raided several farms and killed several settlers. Now, at this point, the U.S. Army had shown up and was there to forcibly, once again, remove the Modocs back to the Klamath Reservation. The Modocs then moved westward to the dried lava beds south of Lake Tool. Now, thousands and thousands of years ago, a volcano had erupted in this area, and the lava had covered the countryside and then dried. So It's a blasted landscape full of ridges and caves that settlers described as hell with the fires out. It was a place where the Modocs knew all the hiding places, and because it's all pretty much solid rock, lava, you can't track anybody on it because people don't leave tracks. So they had a really big advantage there in avoiding the soldiers who were looking for them. There were several pitched skirmishes over the next several months, but essentially the army was unable to nail them down. And this group that had 53 warriors essentially stood up to 3,000 U.S. soldiers for a several month period. Now, during that time, there were about 17 Modoc warriors who were killed in these various skirmishes, and I believe 89 soldiers and militiamen were killed during that same time. So the Modocs kind of had the upper hand. Now, General Canby reached out to Captain Jack. He had put together a peace commission of himself, some other officers, a minister, some civilians that were coming to represent the U.S. government to try to negotiate with the Modocs to get them out of this area and hopefully back to that reservation, potentially to a different reservation. Captain Jack agreed to meet with them. They were going to have this meeting, and the riddles were going to be the translators that were used by the peace commissioners. Now, Captain Jack, his intention was to try to come to some kind of terms with the soldiers. Some of the people, though, that were with him, angry about the losses that they had suffered, resented the idea of surrendering. And in fact, Hooker Jim and his father-in-law, curly-headed doctor, kind of led the way in Modocs who were pressuring Captain Jack not to surrender, but rather to take advantage of this opportunity, meeting with this peace commission, to kill them all, thinking that if the leaders were killed, then the soldiers would go away and not come back. Captain Jack was reluctant to accept this suggestion, and so he was actually made fun of by Hooker Jim and curly-headed doctor. Meanwhile, Toby Riddle, Wanema, had overheard the plans that were being laid to murder the peace commissioners. So that word got back to her, and so she tried to reach the peace commissioners to warn them away, but she didn't get there in time. General Canby and the other commissioners did, in fact, come to the agreed-upon meeting place, whereupon Captain Jack, who had about 20 men hidden among the rocks nearby, gave the order to fire, and he himself fired the shot that killed General Canby. The minister was also killed. A couple of other people were wounded. Wanema got there and actually saved the life of a couple of the wounded commissioners by telling the Modoc warriors that she had seen a large number of soldiers coming just around the corner, so you'd better hightail it out of here. And so they had just been on the verge of scalping these injured people alive, but they left them there and they ran away. As you might guess, this did not have the desired effect at all. Many more soldiers were brought in, outraged at the murder of the major general in charge of the whole region. And in fact, they caught Hooker Jim, and he essentially saved his own hide by agreeing to help them track down Captain Jack and the remaining warriors who were with him. So he became a Modoc hunter for the U.S. Army, which is kind of ironic considering the fact that he and his father-in-law were the ones who had pushed for these murders. But he did successfully lead the soldiers to Captain Jack's hideout, and Captain Jack and his wife and children were captured, and he was put on trial. Here is a photograph of Captain Jack during his 1873 trial. He and a couple of other Modoc warriors were found guilty of murder and hanged. A couple of others were given life prison sentences. The rest of Captain Jack's band, including Hooker Jim and Curly-Headed Doctor, were not sent back to that Klamath Reservation in Oregon at all, but instead they were sent to Indian Territory as prisoners of war, where they were confined on a reservation that had been set aside for the Eastern Shawnee. And after many years, a piece was carved out of that reservation and became the Modoc Reservation. This reservation in northeastern Oklahoma is still today the reservation, the home of the descendants of Captain Jack's Modoc band. I think there are a couple of hundred of them who still live there. That was Captain Jack's band. However, the majority, the large majority of Modocs never left that Klamath Reservation in Oregon where they had been removed to. And over time, they settled their differences with the Klamath, and actually there were one or two other tribes that were confined to this reservation as well. Today, that reservation is still there, although it is only a fraction of its original size. So today, in the 21st century, there are two groups of Modocs. There are a couple of hundred on a reservation in Oklahoma, and slightly more than that, a few hundred on this reservation in Oregon.